technology, you can all now see my screen share, and I will kind of talk to you folks for the next 25 minutes or so, and then, as Nico said, we'll go into a time of Q&A. Well, it's really is great to be with you this evening, especially to talk on the theme that Nico asked me to come and address, this whole question of why I'm not an atheist. And I want to make it clear actually right at the start, much as I think that's a great title, and it's going to be fun to explore that for the next 20 minutes or so. I want to make it very clear right at the start, though, that my goal is not to beat up on atheism. I have many atheist friends. I have atheist family members. I think it's very much possible to be a thoughtful and reflective atheist. The privilege in my job means I get to talk to many people of all faiths and none, and I know many atheists who have thought very deeply and critically about their position. So while I think atheism is not true, and I'm going to give you some reasons why I think that's the case this evening, I also want to take it very, very seriously and respectfully. And so as I go this evening, one thing you'll notice that I'm going to be quoting several atheist writers. In fact, I'm going to quote to you probably actually more atheist writers this evening than Christian ones, because I want to show them that I'm actually taking atheism seriously as a belief system. And I say that quite deliberately, actually, that atheism is a belief system, because I think it's important to recognize that all of us have beliefs. All of us have beliefs that we hold dearly. Christians have beliefs, atheists have beliefs, people of all faiths have different beliefs. And of course, if you have beliefs of any kind, you have to be able to defend them. You have to be able to explain why you think they're true. You have to be able to persuade others why the things you believe are true and the things that they believe perhaps are not. And in fact, ultimately, that's, I think, the only good reason to believe anything, if it's actually true. If atheism is true, we should believe it. On the other hand, if Christianity is true, again, we should believe it. Which raises the question, of course, of how do we decide what's true? How do we decide what's true when we look at some of the big questions of life? And I happen to think that the best way to decide what is true is the method that we use in so many other areas of life. The area that we use in law, the method that we use in law, in science, in history, in almost every branch of knowledge. And in those areas, in those fields, what we do is we look at the evidence in front of us and we ask which theory, which hypothesis, which belief best explains the evidence in front of us. Now, when it comes to the question of Christianity or atheism, I actually think there are about 30 or 40 lines of evidence, pieces of data that are actually better explained by Christianity. And you'll be deeply relieved to hear that I do not plan to cover all of them this evening in the next 20 minutes or so. But I would like to, over those 20 minutes, set out 5 different pieces of evidence, which taken together, individually, they may only get you so far, but taken together, I think offer a pretty compelling reason why one should believe Christianity and disbelieve atheism. And they're quite a different range of things here. So hopefully as I go through these 5 pieces of evidence, some will appeal to different people in the audience. If you're more scientific, you may prefer some. If you're more of a humanities person or more into the arts or music or culture, you may appreciate others. And then we're going to come into land on quite an interesting place indeed. So let's get right in and offer you my first piece of evidence why I'm a Christian and why I think Christianity is true and atheism isn't. And it concerns the question of why science works. You know, science is one of the best things that human beings have ever invented. It's been phenomenal, the stuff that science has given us. But I wonder if you've ever asked yourself the question, why does science work? Why does science actually work in the first place? For example, science depends upon the universe and the laws of physics being stable and predictable and repeatable and logical. But of course, it didn't have to be that way. We could have found ourselves living in an entirely random, incoherent, irrational universe. But that's not the case. We live in a very ordered, very stable, very rational universe. And that raises the question, why? Why is that? It certainly didn't have to be that way. Why can we do science in the first place? Related to that, of course, is the strange enigma of just how finely tuned some of the laws of science are, particularly in physics. as scientists over the last few decades have poured deeper and deeper into the heart of the universe and uncovered more and more about how the universe works, we discovered that some of the numbers plugged into the laws of physics are very precisely balanced. For example, in physics, there's a thing called the gravitational constant, which determines how strong the force of gravity is. And if that were just an infinitesimal amount higher than it is, there would be no universe here to speak of. If it was smaller, the same would be the case. It literally is like the porridge in Goldilocks, absolutely just right. And science is chock full of these numbers that are so perfectly balanced. And if that were not the case, we would not be here talking about it. In fact, so carefully balanced and so finely tuned is so much of the laws of physics that a very famous atheist cosmologist, Sir Fred Hoyle, who actually coined the term the Big Bang. Fred was a committed atheist, but towards the end of his life, looking at the feature of these numbers in physics, Fred said a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers that one calculates from the facts seems to me to be so overwhelming so as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Now, of course, if the God described by the Bible exists, a God who carefully and intricately brought this universe into creation, that actually gives us a very, very good reason indeed, not just for why science works, why the universe is stable and so forth, but also why those laws of physics that Fred there was wrestling over, why they are indeed so intricately and carefully designed. So that's the first piece of evidence I would point you to. Let me do another scientific one while we're on the theme of science, because my background before I moved into the area that I did my PhD, and I was actually involved in the sciences, and I've always loved science, and science is a fascinating thing. Another area of science that's deeply fascinating is this strange fit we have between maths and science. We talked a moment ago about how the laws of physics are these beautiful constructions that constructed using the language of mathematics. And in fact, numbers describe reality really, really, really well, which is why things like physics and so forth work so powerfully. But there's a little bit of a puzzle here. And the puzzle is simply this. Think about this question for a moment. What exactly is a number? You know, what is the number 2 or the number 7 or so forth? Well, of course, if there is no God, if we do live in an atheistic universe, the numbers are simply something that Mesopotamian goat herders invented sometime round about the 2nd millennium BC in order to keep track of their flocks. But of course, if that's the case, how is it that numbers and mathematics so beautifully can equally describe the curvature of space-time, the growth patterns of flowers, or the orbit of planets and electrons? How is it that maths and physics fit so beautifully well together? Is this just a lucky coincidence? The astrophysicist Paul Davies, who's not an atheist, but probably an agnostic. He isn't sure whether he believes in God or he doesn't, but he's certainly not a Christian of any kind. Very famous astrophysicist, cosmologist. Paul, in his book, The Goldilocks Enigma, writes, "This is one of the deepest mysteries of science. Why is nature shadowed by a mathematical reality? Why does theoretical physics even work in the first place?" Well, of course, if you are an atheist, you have to conclude this is just a very, very lucky coincidence. You know, those good old goat herders, somehow they struck gold, or somehow they had incredible foresight. Or you have to conclude that something else is going on. And that strange fit between maths and physics and the way they integrate, they lock together so beautifully, I would argue is another pointer, another clue to the fact the laws of physics are in fact intricately and carefully and beautifully designed, and a big, big pointer to the fact that we are not living in an atheist universe, but living in a very different kind of universe, one with a God behind it. Well, let's turn from the sciences, which maybe get some of you excited, maybe others of you go, I struggled with the sciences at school, please, can we change the record? Let's talk about another piece of evidence and another piece of data. And this time concerns something very different. You know, it concerns human rights and it concerns dignity, human value and dignity, things that we are ever more aware of how important they are for the kind of societies that we're trying to build today. Well, we forget, of course, that human rights, at least in its current form, is a fairly modern thing. In fact, we trace modern human rights theory back to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was carved out shortly after World War II. And listen to these powerful and beautiful words from the preamble to that important document. They write, the founders of this right, they say the recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom and justice and peace in the world. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Now, those are beautiful, powerful words, but of course they do raise a profound question, don't they? If all human beings do bear rights and value and dignity, where precisely is that dignity located? Let me illustrate the problem with a little illustration for a moment. Imagine that we would draw a circle, like on the PowerPoint slide here. And in that circle, we have the DNA, the genomes of every living thing on planet Earth. Everything that exists is somewhere in that circle, from amoeba to ants, to aardvarks, to lettuces, to human beings, to traffic wardens, just seeing if you're still listening. Everything is in that circle somewhere. Now, when we talk about human rights and human dignity, what we're doing is we're coming along and we're drawing a smaller circle inside that bigger circle and saying, if you live in that small circle, if you have human DNA, if you are of the human species, then you have a special dignity and a certain set of rights that things living outside the circle don't enjoy. But of course, there's a problem. And the problem is simply, what's to stop the white supremacist coming along and drawing an even smaller circle inside your already small circle and saying, no, human rights and dignity do not belong to the whole human family. They only belong to a small part of it. And of course, the problem is that both have drawn circles, both have drawn smaller circles, and both are arguably arbitrary. Why is one admirable and we give Nobel Prizes for human rights, and why is the other condemnable? We condemn people, we lock people up for acting on our kind of racial discrimination and so forth. Now, of course, you may think this is just purely academic, but I suggest not. I think this is actually, we're onto something very, very crucial here. And we're reminded of this if we look back at even relatively recent history. In 1857, the gentleman on the screen here, Dred Scott, he was an African-American slave. And he made legal history when in 1857, he sued his owner for his freedom. And the court, the legal case, the Dred Scott case, made it all the way to the US Supreme Court, who actually ruled against him. And the justices in that decision from the US Supreme Court, this is what they said. They said the question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen, one of which rights is the privilege of suing in a court of the United States in the cases specified in the Constitution? We think not, and that they, i.e. Africans, are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures the citizens of the United States. Now, of course, we read a passage like that some 150, 160 years on, and of course, we wince with embarrassment at how our ancestors behaved. And of course, the problem is that all that the justices did in the Dred Scott decision was they drew a circle. They drew a circle, a slightly smaller circle than we would draw today when we talk about human rights, but nevertheless, just a random circle. And the problem is that atheism offers us no way out of this dilemma, no way by which we can say those who are human are all members of the human family, are born equal in dignity and rights, and so forth. Atheism doesn't really offer us a language or a framework or any way to address that in a way that I suggest actually Christianity does. And don't take my words for it. Take the words of the leading Australian atheist, Raymond Gaitart, who said this. He said, "We may say that all human beings are inestimably precious. We may say that they are ends in themselves, that they are owed unconditional respect, they possess inalienable rights, and of course, that they possess inalienable dignity. But in my judgment, these are just ways of trying to say what we feel the need to say when we are estranged from the conceptual resources we need to say it. Be that as it may, each is problematic and each is contentious. Not one of them has the simple power of the religious way of speaking. And I think Raymond's on to something there. And those who've studied the history of human rights have noted that it really was the influence of Christianity with its teaching that all human beings were created in the image of God that forms the foundation on which modern human rights theory stands. Well, related to the question of human rights and dignity is my fourth and penultimate piece of evidence that I want to lay before you this evening. And that's the whole question of morality and the nature of good and of evil. Now, a couple of months ago was the 78th anniversary of the death of two of my heroes from history, but they may be people who many of you on this call have not heard of. Their names were Hans and Sophie Scholl. Now, you may not have heard of those names, but if you were to go to Germany, and if you were to visit Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, you would find an entire university plaza dedicated to the memory of this brother and sister. So who were they? Well, Hans and Sophie were a German brother and sister who in 1941, while at university, became Christians. And they very quickly realized that their newfound faith meant that they had to take a stand against the Nazis and against the Third Reich. And so with the help of a teacher at the university, they formed the White Rose Group. And they began distributing anti-Nazi leaflets and trying to motivate fellow students to take a stand against the Third Reich. Well, on the 18th of February 1943, Hans and Sophie brought a suitcase full of pamphlets to the university, leaving piles of them in corridors for students to find when lectures ended. Now, they had a few pamphlets left in their case, so they deciding it would be a shame to waste them, they climbed the stairs to the top of the atrium and flung them into the courtyard. Unfortunately, they were spotted, the authorities were called, and the group were rounded up and arrested by the Gestapo. 4 days later, they were tried, found guilty of treason, and sentenced to death by guillotine. Sophie Scholl's last words before she was beheaded were these: "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give themselves up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. What does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Now, I suspect many of us, most of us, I hope, would look at Sophie and Hans Scholl and consider them to be moral heroes, incredibly brave, good people who risked their life and actually paid with their lives to try and make a real difference in a society that was increasingly horrific. And of course, by contrast to the moral heroism shown by Hans and Sophie, you have the Nazi regime, which was monstrous and vicious and evil. But immediately a little bit of a problem then emerges. What's the criterion by which you're making that moral judgment? After all, isn't it just personal preference that makes us prefer what Hans and Sophie did to what the Third Reich did? And you see, too often people assume that we can throw out the Christian foundations and keep the morality that was traditionally based upon Christian faith. Well, that actually ultimately is foolishness. As one of the most famous atheists of the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche, famously remarked. Again, Nietzsche, deeply committed atheist, anti-Christian in so much of what he wrote, but also was very, very consistent on calling out fellow atheists for their inconsistency, especially around this issue. And Nietzsche wrote, he said, if you abandon the Christian faith, at the very same time, you are pulling the right to Christian morality out from under your feet. This morality is very far from self-evident. This point needs highlighting time and again. Christianity is a system, a synoptic and complete view of things. If you break off one of its principal concepts, the belief in God, you'll shatter the whole thing. There is nothing necessary left between your fingers. Well, I happen to believe that we do live in a moral universe, that the Scholl's actions really were good, that Hitler really was evil. But if that is the case, if we live in a truly moral universe, then again, that is powerful evidence for Christianity and powerful evidence against atheism, as the famous atheist Friedrich Nietzsche helps us see in this famous quotation. But there is one last piece of evidence that I want to share with you this evening. We've talked about science, we've talked about human rights, we've talked about good and evil and justice and so on. But I want to talk about history for my last kind of 6 minutes or so. You see, we've been talking this evening as if Christianity were an idea, or perhaps a philosophy, or even a religion, when actually that's never really been how Christianity has primarily been presented. See, you may have heard Christians use the word gospel to describe what they believe. That's the word that the New Testament in the Bible uses, and it's the word the first Christians used to describe the message of Jesus that they were preaching. And the English word gospel is actually an English translation, an English rendering of the Greek word euangelion, which quite literally means good news. And just down the road from me, where I live in Dundee, we have St Andrews, and St Andrews University, one of the country's leading educational institutions. And until he moved back to Oxford, there was a professor there called Tom Wright, one of the world's most renowned historians and theologians. And in a little book he wrote on the life of Jesus, he unpacks the significance of why the first Christians chose this word, good news, gospel, to describe the message of Jesus. He wrote, many people today assume that Christianity is a religion, a moral system, a philosophy. In other words, they assume that Christianity is about advice, but it wasn't and isn't. Christianity is simply good news. It is the news that something has happened, as a result of which the world is a different place. You see, one can debate the merits of a religion, a moral system, or a philosophy, but a news event, well, that's discussed in a different way. Either the event happened or it didn't. If it did happen, either it means what people say it means or it doesn't. And you see that news that stands at the heart of the Christian faith is that God is not an abstract idea. God is not a distant being who kind of wound up the clockwork of the universe and then disappeared off, never to be seen again. But rather, the news at the heart of the Christian faith is that God then stepped into the world that he had made, stepped into history in the person of Jesus Christ. And Christians like myself are simply people who have looked at the life and the character and the claims of Jesus of Nazareth and decided that those claims, dramatic as they are, stand up, that they measure up, and that they're true. And indeed that many of the claims that Jesus made, many of which were bold and outrageous enough to eventually get him crucified by the authorities, that those claims that he made about himself were vindicated when he rose dramatically from the dead that first Easter Sunday morning. And it's the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus and the full light of history on which Christianity primarily stands. A historical event for which there is tremendous historical evidence. And if you want to delve more into that, we can do that in the Q&A. See, if Jesus was who he said he was and did what he claimed, that is good news. And sure, we can test good news intellectually, but we also need to test good news existentially. We need to see whether it changes how we live, because news is really only news if it actually changes something. 24 years ago this month, in fact, I met my wife. And on the 30th of August 1997, I asked her to marry me. And amazingly, she said yes, and there was no wine involved in that decision. Now, of course, I then immediately rushed out and told people the incredible news that the most beautiful, wonderful woman in the world had madly agreed to marry me. Now, suppose one of my friends, perhaps a philosophy student, had then said to me when I'd rung him up to tell him, imagine he'd said to me, well, Andy, that's an interesting claim that you've just told me there. Let's test the claim that you're now engaged to Ashtead using modal logic and see whether it aligns with the philosophy of Aristotle, Wittgenstein, and Kant. Then we can decide whether it's rational for you to describe yourself as engaged. Well, arguably, my friend's response there would have missed something. Primarily, they would have missed that I wasn't making a philosophical argument, but I was sharing a piece of news, in which case the only thing that matters is, was that news true, and did it mean what I think it means? My world changed with that piece of news, but the news at the heart of the Christian faith is even more world-changing. See, philosophical arguments are important, but they can also be used as decoys and as distractions. Because if Jesus is who he claimed to be, then that Christianity doesn't merely make sense, it is sense. It's the true story of reality, of who God is, who we are, and who would not want to be part of that. In conclusion, Why am I not an atheist? Because I believe Christianity makes far, far more sense, far better sense of a wealth of evidence. We've just scratched the surface tonight, but a wealth of evidence from science, from philosophy, from art and ethics, and so much more. But that ultimately, because its truth was powerfully demonstrated there in history, in the good news of Jesus Christ. Thanks for listening so patiently. I'm going to pass back over to Nico, and we're going to move into the next part of the evening. Thanks for listening.
I think we're handing back to Avril and I, actually.
I'm sorry, Chris.
Very exciting, Andy. So we've had we've had a whole host of questions coming through. I think I suspect people are still digesting and thinking about what you've said, and so welcome people to go to the chat function if you haven't already, and maybe if anything has pricked your imagination and you want to post up a question, please do so. So whilst you guys think about that, I think Avril's going to ping off some of the questions that we've received, Andy, and they're coming from all different directions, which is great. So keep you on your toes for the next 20 minutes or so.
That was great, Andy. Thank you so much. some of the questions are so brilliant, I don't really understand them.
Oh, that's fantastic then. That's great.
So I'm going to start, rather you than me, with is atheism a religion?
Well, there is a really interesting question. I'm going to be very, very cheeky, because authors like to be cheeky. And so to really answer that question, you should take a look at my book, especially chapter 2, which addresses that question. Let me begin by saying to whoever asked that question, atheism is definitely a belief system. And those who study, the sociology of religion would say the signs that it's actually a belief system is belief systems are things that try and answer ultimate questions. Questions like, why are we all here? What's the purpose of life? What's gone wrong with the world? What's the solution? Is there a God? Those kind of big questions. And atheism certainly tries to answer those questions. So atheism is certainly a belief system. Where I think for some it becomes a religion is once it becomes a thing around which you define your life. And, religions don't have to have God at the center of them. There are godless religions. Buddhism in its original form, I was going to say, for example, would be an example of a godless religion. To some extent, Shintoism and other kind of pieces. And I think once atheism becomes the sort of identity around which you build yourself, and I come across folks who, their social media profile is, all about how they're an atheist. They spend most of their time watching atheist videos, reading atheist books, going to atheist conferences. There are actually now even atheist churches. There was a little movement that started in London a few years ago called the Sunday Assembly, where a group of humanists took over an old deconsecrated Anglican church and started holding kind of weekly meetings where they'd sing secular songs and listen to lectures and have tea and biscuits afterwards. And, many commentators remarked, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it possibly is a duck. So, yeah, I would say it's definitely a belief system, and therefore my atheist friends need to give reasons for it. But for some, I think it's crossed that line into being a religion. And I think lastly, the last thought I'd leave whoever asked that with there is I think because we are wired to be religious. We are wired to be religious as humans. And if you sort of push God out the door, as it were, you create a vacuum and something else is going to come into its place. There is, in one sense, no such thing as a non-religious human being.
Mm. Mm. And sort of, it follows on quite nicely. There's another question that says, aren't all religions basically the same?
Oh, fantastic. What a brilliant question. Thank you very, very much for that. I almost feel like my literary agent is posting questions, because there's a book I've written just on that subject that's just come out in the last month. So the simple answer is no. But I just, again, to give a bit more kind of context, I think, to that. When I, first began sort of studying comparative religion, first began doing a lot of, dialoguing with Muslim sort of friends in London, I think I probably assumed they were. I certainly assumed that Christianity and Islam were broadly the same. After all, we both believed in one God, both believe in a creator, and so on and so forth. It was only as I began studying in more detail and then began my PhD, actually digging into the Quran, reading it properly, learning Arabic so I could read it properly. I remember being struck by, gosh, this is incredibly, incredibly different. And the simple answer is no. The major religions of the world teach wildly different things. Just to stay on my, area of expertise, take something so basic as the question of, was Jesus crucified? Now, the Bible says, yes, it's the central event at the heart of the Gospels and the New Testament. And in fact, historians will tell you it's one of the most well-attested events of first century history, actually. Along comes the Quran and denies that Jesus was crucified, because for the Quran, the Quranic theology says that, well, prophets can't possibly, suffer like that, and therefore Jesus wasn't crucified. Well, you can't really reconcile that. You can't really say, yes, he was, and no, he wasn't. In my book, I go into more detail around things like the character of God. The character of God is vastly different. For example, in Christianity, you have a God who's relational, a God who can be known, a God who is love, a God who has demonstrated that love by suffering in the person of Jesus. And the Quran directly denies all of those characteristics. And so it looks like a very different God. And then lastly, I would say, the thing I think differentiates Christianity from all of the religious belief systems in the world, all the other religious belief systems out there, you can sort of analyze them in different ways, but generally you can say of them, you achieve, salvation, nirvana, paradise, whatever it is you're looking for, through your own efforts. You either have to master the right system of knowledge. Religions like Buddhism, it's all about what you know. There are Eastern religions where it's all about the experience you have. You have to have the right mystical experience, and maybe you'll get to where you're looking for. And then other religions are very works-based. Keep the right commandments, work hard enough, and you'll get to, heaven. Christianity reverses that entire pattern and says, actually, it's not about you. It isn't about your effort. It's not about what you know, experience, or do, but it's about what God has done for you. I would say every other religion is ultimately a self-help system. Christianity is a salvation system that says, actually, you can't help yourself, but God in Jesus has come to rescue us and do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. And so, yeah, I would say they're vastly, vastly different.
Mm-hmm. That was brilliant. Thank you. Okay. I'm so glad this is you, not me. This is the next question. In the end, for both atheism and Christianity, you have to make that leap of faith.
Yeah, that's a really, firstly, thank you for the question, whoever opposite. And I also like the observation that there's faith involved in both atheism and Christianity. And I do think there's faith involved. I actually think there's faith involved in every everyday decision, actually. Sometimes we think that faith just operates in the realm of sort of religion, but it doesn't. It operates in the realm of science. I have to sort of trust and assume when I do science that the world tomorrow will function the same as it's functioning today. We can't prove the regularity of the laws of physics. We have to sort of assume them as scientists. And then even something so simple as, most of you watching this evening, you came and sat down on your chair or your sofa. I'm assuming you didn't do an engineering test to see if it would take your weight, for example. You trusted it. You exercised faith. If you drank a cup of coffee that your spouse made, you trusted that your spouse has not had enough of you during lockdown and stuck arsenic in your beverage. We use faith in everyday decisions too. And faith is not so much a case of being, faith versus evidence. I think what we do, particularly in the Christian faith, is I think you look at where the evidence takes you, and then you ask, am I willing to put my trust on the basis of that faith? And in fact, the word faith actually means just that. It means trust. So to go back to that marriage example I ended with, the point on the 30th of August 1997 when I asked Ashtead to marry me, I knew a lot of facts about my wife. I knew the kind of things she liked. I knew what her interests were. I knew what jokes she liked, not the ones I like to tell, unfortunately, but there we are. And the list goes on. I knew lots of bits of data about her. But the moment I asked her to marry me, then I was taking a step of faith. I was now putting my trust in her and asking her to put her trust in me. And Christians are people who've looked at what God has done in Jesus, looked at the evidence that I've laid out tonight in many more pieces, but particularly the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and said, on the basis of what God has done, yes, I will trust. There's good reasons. We can't know everything, but we can still trust on good reasons. I would say by converse, I think there aren't good reasons in atheism, because if atheism is true, everything is ultimately just atoms and particles in motion. I think it's even doubtful whether we can actually know anything at all. So I think Christians are in a much stronger position with every respect.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you, Andy.
That's great, Andy. Thank you. We're getting a number of questions actually relating to the science part of your talk, and yeah. I think rather than picking those up necessarily now, we have got a whole big questions, I think, on week 3 and 5, which is going to deal with Christianity and science and where that fits. So I'm not going to focus on those unless we start to run out of other questions. Just that's for people.
I think you've got Ruth Bankovich coming, haven't you, in 2 weeks' time, who is phenomenal. So absolutely, I just second that. People are asking. Ruth is just incredibly gifted communicator, brilliant scientist. So save your toughest questions, because Ruth will do a much better job than I would do on the sciences.
Okay, well, on that note, to move away slightly from science, another question is, do you believe in ghosts?
Do I believe in ghosts? That's a very good question. Let me just say something by way of background to it. I certainly believe in an afterlife. I don't believe this life is just all that there is, because again, as I'm a Christian, so I believe that we are body, soul, and spirit. There is a spiritual component to us, and not just a material part. So I don't believe that life ends at death. But I also believe that the Bible is very clear that when we die, that generally is, with one or two very sort of notable exceptions, people who did come back, like Jesus raised a couple of people from the dead who then proceeded to die again. And then Jesus is the one example of someone who has come back. I don't believe that death is like is like a cat flap that swings to and fro. So sort of things from the other side can come back and sort of leap up and say boo. So in one sense, I don't believe in ghosts in the way that I guess that question might be asking, but I do believe in the supernatural. I do believe that we are more than just the atoms of which we're made. And so therefore, the big questions and we're thinking about in this series, what we do with our life right now, really matters, because it does have eternal consequences. What I do find interesting about ghosts, though, is how interesting it is that we are wired to look for the spiritual stuff. I mean, I lived in Canada for 6 years, one of the most secular countries in the world. And I remember, one of the very first airplane journeys I took out to Vancouver Island on this tiny kind of 16-seater flight, opened the in-flight magazine for this airline, and there was an 8-page article on ghosts, half the magazine, how to know if your house has one, how to befriend it, how to get it to do things for you. And I found myself thinking, interesting, even in a very secular country, those spiritual beliefs pop up. And as one famous Christian writer said, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. So no, I don't believe in ghosts in that sense, but I do believe in the spiritual, and I do believe in the supernatural, absolutely.
That's brilliant.
Great, thank you.
Andy, thanks. And kind of leading on from that, another question is, why is there something rather than nothing? I suppose is the question. They've also put that's not one of the songs for next week, which I thought was very funny.
Yes, I'll very quickly on that one. As I think I mentioned at the start of the talk, Chris, that I had about sort of 50 or 60 things that we could have covered if we had all evening to explore this stuff. And actually, why there is something rather than nothing is a massive challenge, I think, if you want to try and explain reality purely in an atheistic framework. Because for a Christian, of course, the answer is because the Bible is clear that at the beginning of space-time, God brought the universe into existence literally from nothing. He didn't make it out of his existing stuff. He made it literally out of nothing. The problem is, if you are an atheist and you want to try and explain why there is something rather than nothing, you get in a real problem at that point, because stuff doesn't come into existence from nothing. According to laws of physics, we can explain how stuff behaves when we have it, but why we have stuff in the first place becomes incredibly problematic. And that's one of the oldest arguments for the existence of God, has been the fact that we live in a universe full of stuff. Ultimately, you need to jump outside the material to find something. And so, yeah, I find it interesting that one or two well-known atheist writers are now almost leaping into the miraculous themselves and claiming that things can just pop into existence from nothing. But I wish that were the case, because then we could open our online banking apps tomorrow and perhaps assume that £1 million might have appeared overnight. But that doesn't tend to happen. Things generally require causes. And so without something very like a God behind the whole show, it's very, very hard to even begin to conceive why there is a universe in the first place. So yeah, from a Christian point of view, powerful argument for the existence of God. If you are an atheist, that's the kind of thing that would keep me awake at night, I think.
No, that's brilliant. And I think, sort of leading on from that, again, someone's asked a question, I think kind of referring, I think, to the conflict between sort of the biblical timeline, if you like, of the creation story and the geological timescale that we see in science, and how do you approach that discussion and reconcile that in respect of atheism and Christianity?
Brilliant question. Again, I'll defer half of that perhaps actually to when you have Ruth. It'd be a great question to put to Ruth in a couple of weeks' time, as someone who's thought deeply about the science question. The simple answer is that I think if you read the opening account of the book of Genesis, I think it's very important when we read any text, whether that text be the Bible or any text, in fact, that you read it and ask the questions of it that the author intended. And I don't think the book of Genesis was written to answer those kind of questions. I think once you start sitting down and trying to extract timetables and timescales and map it onto what we know in modern science, that's a huge mistake. I think the opening chapters of the book of Genesis were actually written to do a number of things. They were written to make it very clear that we live in a universe that's been created from nothing by God. Make it very clear about some of the structure that God's built into that universe, and very clear to establish the relationship between us and God, how that was intended to be and what went wrong. And once you understand it that way, then actually there's a number of ways that you can read Genesis, I think, very much in harmony with modern science. And in fact, whoever asked that, particularly mentioned geology, if you want to dig into that, is a wonderful book. I was trying to see if I could see it on my shelf because I could give you the author, but I can't, so I'm going to give the title. It's called The Bible, the Rocks and Time, which is a study of actually really interesting historical study of how geology developed. Actually, many Christians involved in the early study of geology, and really how, you can read the geological record and the, what's going on in Genesis very much in harmony together, written by two American geologists whose names I escape me, but The Bible, the Rocks and Time. It's a great lively read.
Thanks, Andy. That's really, really helpful. Hopefully that person that asked that question will go and buy the books.
I'm not on commission, I just stressed.
There's another little straightforward question for you. When, and then in brackets, if you debate atheists, do they find your views on atheism not having the words to define human rights objectionable?
Well, interesting you say that. I would not say objectionable. I think there's a very lively debate. And so it's interesting that I very deliberately quoted to you tonight people like, I quoted you Raymond Gaita, who's an Australian atheist. On the shelf behind me, I've got a wonderful book called Dominion, written by a historian called Tom Holland. Tom is not a Christian, and Dominion is really a long sort of range historical study of the legacy of Christianity, particularly in the West. And Tom, who's an atheist, would make the observation that actually it's Christianity we have to thank for the idea of human rights. As he points out, in the ancient world, it was simply taken as a given that some people had more rights than others. If you were a man and you had money and power, you obviously were worth more than somebody who was poor or a woman or a slave or from a different race or so on. That was simply taken as a given. And it was the Christian idea, based actually on the book of Genesis, that all human beings are born have the image of God and have a value and dignity because of how God has created and breathed his spirit into them. As Tom points out, that lies behind everything that we hold dear in the West, and many, many other writers have said the same thing. So yeah, I have had actually several dialogues with atheists on this. In fact, the person who asked that, if you really want to see a really interesting one of the world's leading atheist ethicists is a chap called Peter Singer, another Australian atheist, actually now based in the States. Lovely guy, really friendly, kind of gracious man. I really enjoyed debating him. And I did a debate with him for a Christian radio station and media outlet called Premier in London. And if you Google my name and then Peter Singer, you'll find that it's on their website, it's on YouTube. And what's interesting actually is Peter actually begins in that debate we did by denying that human rights exist. Because as an atheist, he thinks it's a ludicrous idea. He doesn't like the idea of human rights. So actually, interestingly, he sort of almost in one sense agrees with me that actually human rights only make sense if Christianity is true, but he doesn't think human rights exist. He doesn't think God exists. But he shifts slightly as we go. But I hope watching that, you'll see that Christians like myself and atheists, we can have a really it's a friendly debate. We spar, and then we kind of shook hands afterwards and a cup of tea afterwards because we got on really well. He's a nice guy. So yeah, I have never had an atheist say to me, well, hang on, I find that offensive, because I think actually everybody knows there's a big debate here. And in fact, Sam Harris, who's a leading American, one of the so-called new atheists, he's also on record as saying it's a massive challenge for atheists to explain human rights. It really, really is a big issue. And what tends to happen is that my atheist friends assume they can just talk about it, but once you ask the question why, that's where the challenge becomes. So I think it's a great topic for atheists and Christians to talk about, and let's do so respectfully, because we can disagree, but disagree agreeably.
No, that's really, really helpful, Andy.
Great, thank you.
So I've got one more question. So you've answered the question tonight, albeit you used 5 strands rather than the 30 or 40 that you suggested you could run us through about why I'm not an atheist, which I suppose is answering the question from your perspective as to why you are a Christian. I just kind of, I suppose I wanted to know, you know, why are you a Christian, and what difference has it made to your life being one?
Yeah. Well, ultimately, in one sense, Chris, I told the story, almost the story of my life in reverse kind of this evening. So I'm ultimately a Christian because I believe that the claims that Jesus made about himself stand up. I believe you can put them to the test, you can put them to scrutiny. I believe that the evidence of his death and resurrection are overwhelming. So it's because of Jesus, what he did, what he said, his death and resurrection, that I'm a Christian. But what was interesting, I was, raised in a Christian home and really just took these things for granted until my late teens, early 20s, when I then began really encountering atheists and Muslims and others who were well thought through and were very easily able to, tie me up in knots and run rings around me. And that was when I first began realizing, I need to actually investigate and see if these things are true. I've got a questioning, critical mind. I'm always questioning, always reading. And it was only really then in my early 20s that I began reading and studying deeply, and almost then went back down that reverse journey. We went from the bottom up tonight. I ended up in kind of philosophy of science and loved it and stuff. But that wasn't where I began. That was where the foundations went in. So Jesus ultimately, because that point I ended with this evening, he's good news. Absolutely, I think he is. And the difference that it makes, especially now, I would say, is that I think all of us, Chris, do two things. All of us need a basis for hope in our lives. I think the last year with COVID has shown we can't live without hope. It's pretty tough if you try and get through life, especially through tough times without hope. And I think if Christianity is true, which I think it is, there is tremendous hope, because we know that death is not the end. We know that our purpose in life is not just how much pleasure we can get on any foreign holidays we can go on. We are made for something bigger. We're made for a relationship with a God who loves us. And then I think the other thing, Chris, that following Jesus gives me is all of us as human beings worship something. One of my favorite atheist quotations didn't make it in tonight because it didn't fit the topic. But there was a wonderful atheist novelist called David Foster Wallace who said, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships something. And he goes on to talk about how some of us worship career, some worship money and power and influence, some of us worship sex and image. And then he goes on to say the problem with worshiping all of those things is ultimately they will let you down and devour and destroy you. If you worship power, you'll need ever more power over people. If you worship your image and your sexuality, well, one day you'll grow old and wrinkly, and then you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. If you worship money, you will never have enough, and so on. And he says, actually, that's a very good reason for worshipping, as he puts it, some type of spiritual type thing, because Jesus ultimately, I think, is the only thing worthy of worship. Because rather than try and take more and more and more and more from you, which is what happens if you try and worship your career, money, those kind of things, ultimately those false gods will demand more and more, they suck you dry. Jesus said, I've come that you might have life and have it to the full. And that's been my experience of following Jesus for 30 years. That he's brought me life and hope and peace and joy and all kinds of other things, and has also helped deal with some of the rough corners in my life and edges of my personality that do need a good dealing with. And in the 30 years that I put my trust in him, he hasn't let me down.
That's brilliant.
That's brilliant, Andy. Thank you so much for sharing that last bit, but also everything else before. Really compelling. I know there's lots of questions we didn't get to, and I'm sorry about that. You can just ping them through to Nico. He knows all the answers to these things. And so without any problem at all, he's he hasn't written any books that I'm aware of.
I have.
So what he does are. Have you?
Yeah, I do.
You've just finished your first novel, have you, Nico?
Yeah.
Anyway, so we're going to part. I know this is the part where we pass over to you, isn't it, Nico, to give the results on best question and song for next week.
Yes. So just very quickly as we close today, is the song choice was my song choice. This is just my decision. So Do You Know Where You're Going To by Diana Ross, and that was Jennifer Westwood. So you'll get a book later, and then the questions. I've got 3, and you get to choose. So we're going to poll it. So you have to decide which one you want from these 3. And while you're deciding, maybe Andy can share a bit about his book, and you can try and sell your 2 books. Andy, let's know a bit more so people can know a bit more about the book while they answer this poll. But the question is, question 1 is atheism a religion? Question 2, in the end, for both atheism and Christianity, you have to make a leap of faith. And thirdly, do you believe in ghosts? So choose which of those you felt was the best question, everyone on the poll. And meanwhile, Andy's going to share a bit about the 2 books he's written.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. Well, the poll comes in. So very briefly, the first one on that list that we mentioned earlier, so my book, The Atheist Didn't Exist, that really about 15 years ago now, a phenomenon called the New Atheism began, people like Richard Dawkins and so on. Atheism really went mainstream, but I began to notice there were lots of really bad arguments, and I had atheist friends actually complaining about some of the quality of the arguments that were being used. So that book takes 10, maybe 11 of the sort of common arguments you can often hear, particularly on the internet or in the media, from some sort of celebrity atheist, and has a little bit of fun with them. It's a combination of comedy and some of the stuff we've done tonight, but really helps you think about some of these issues, and I think show why the Christian faith has some compelling answers. Last chapter really looked at this and why we believe what we believe about Jesus. So that would be a great book if you're into that kind of thing. And then my most recent one came out 6 ago, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? And that really is a question I hear so often in today's culture. It came up tonight, right? Are all religions the same? And I use a comparison between Christianity and Islam as the way to look at that. And again, just the style that I present in, the style I write in, it's fast moving, it's funny, it's very accessible. It's not an academic book. Half the footnotes are comedy ones and stuff. And so hopefully, again, help you think about that big question, but also have a lot of fun as you read at the same time.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. So question number 2 was a winner. In the end, for both atheism and Christianity, you have to make that leap of faith. So again, I'll look afterwards in the chat, see who did ask that question, and you're going to receive a book as well. So just to say thank you, everyone, for coming. And next Tuesday, we'll be looking at Is There Life After Death, which is a really, really interesting thing to look at. So please do connect next Tuesday. Our local Dr. Alison Anderson will be speaking about that, and our local Vicar Richard Jones will be speaking about that. So it's going to be really interesting. Please come along, and thanks so much for joining us. I'm just going to add Chris and Avril, who have been hosting, just so you can say goodbye as well. But thanks so much, Andy, for everything you've shared. It's been really interesting. Thanks, because you're such a kind of normal, lovely guy. So it's also easier to connect with you as well, to know that you're kind of normal as we are. We think we are, at least.
I think we could do a virtual hand clap, can't we, for Andy tonight?
Oh, that's very kind. It's been great to be with you, and thank you to all of you who joined this evening. It was great to see so many of you.
You're brilliant, Andy. Thank you so much.
That's really, really great. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. As Nico said, hopefully see you next week, 8 o'clock, same link, I think. And we can listen to Richard and Alison. Take care, everybody.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. See you. Bye.